Hey guys, it's Mike here, and in this video, I want to discuss a topic that has to do with Cell, and more specifically, a character that makes up some of his genetic structure. A character who forcefully had some of his cells extracted and inserted into the bio-android known as Cell. That would have to be Frieza. And exactly what effect did Frieza have on Cell? Well, in this video, I'm going to be discussing that in depth, taking a look at the manga and seeing exactly what effect the evil Emperor of the Universe had on the perfect life form. But before I begin, if you're new to this channel, consider subscribing and enabling all notifications. That way you can stay up to date with all of my future videos. Also, make sure to leave a like, share this video out, share your own thoughts down below so we can go even further beyond. With that being said, let's get into the video. So when we were first introduced to Cell, he seemed quite different from Frieza. However, the more we look deeper into the subject of the two of them, their personalities, their actions, and other little parallels that happen between the two over time, you'll be able to see that there's a lot more of an effect that the Emperor of the Universe had upon Cell. So let's begin with Frieza and some of his events and escapades in the story. And we're going to begin, of course, with when Frieza became his final form, because these are the two forms that really seem to share the most similarity in terms of their overall execution and personality shifts, which also makes perfect sense because the fact that Frieza in his final form as Mecha Frieza is the genetic structure that was taken and input into Cell. And there definitely seems to be a difference in personality and some of the other ways that Frieza conducts himself in his true form versus his other forms, which I may discuss in another video in the future. Nonetheless, we see that when Frieza first emerges upon the scene in his final form, he goes on to immediately use his power, showing just how devastating he can be and just how big of a jump he increased by when he's able to shoot his death beam directly past everyone without them barely even being able to register it happened and immediately killing Dende. This shows Frieza in his strongest form, his final form at the time, being the one that would immediately wipe out a character and change the slate. This is something that Frieza once again does after he was hit by the Spirit Bomb by Goku, which led to him again showing up on the scene after everyone thought that he was dead in this case, and firing a blast that went right through Piccolo, leading to him falling to the ground. Depending upon the version you watch, Piccolo jumped in the way of the beam in order to stop Goku from being hit. However, in this version, the manga, it almost seems like he purposely targeted Piccolo, and then Piccolo, in his getting hit in the process, slammed into the rest of them, which is a possibility as well. Nonetheless, this is all something that actually repeated itself with Cell, who not only demonstrated that he inherited this ability as well as a number of others, which I'll get into soon, from Frieza, but also when he proceeded to use it, he used it not only against Gohan during their fight, but also when he returned from self-destruction, which in turn caused him to immediately attack one of the fighters on the scene, in this case Trunks instead of Dende with Frieza, and proceeding to kill him. However, in this case, it seems like this was less intention to kill Trunks and more that he fired indiscriminately and just got so lucky as to kill Trunks again. And of course, this was him in his most powerful form at the time when he returned. Now, on the topic of the death beam, another interesting parallel actually happens when Frieza is fighting against Super Saiyan Goku. More specifically, he's really frustrated that Goku continues to dodge his attacks because Frieza, without going to his bulked up 100%, is at a disadvantage in terms of his power against the Super Saiyan. And so as a result, Goku actually challenges him to hit him with the attack, which he proceeds to do, firing a blast, which then hits Goku in the face, but barely does any damage other than a little busted lip. The same situation happens with semi-perfect Cell when he's fighting against Vegeta and is also outmatched. He goes full power and he proceeds to run and punch Vegeta right in the face. However, this results in pretty much the exact same scene in which, as you could see right here, Goku slowly reveals his face to show barely any damage, and very similarly, Vegeta also slowly reveals his face to show barely any damage. In fact, they received the exact same amount of damage, in which they have a busted lip on the very same side. This is what leads to Cell freaking out after he realizes just how outgunned he is, and proceeding to go into a desperation measure, which is something we see Frieza demonstrate a number of different times, and Cell parallels as well. For example, with Frieza, after he was defeated by Goku, who had given up on the fight because he saw no more purpose of fighting against someone who was much weaker than himself, especially after Frieza's power went down, we saw that Frieza decided to use a desperation measure in which he used his own variation of the Destructo Disc, these death spheres or death discs or whatever they're called in this version, and he proceeds to start using them against Goku, which inevitably fails because it leads to Frieza getting cut in half, or getting sliced and diced really, by his own technique. And this is something that Cell also does in the anime version when he tries to throw his various different techniques at Gohan after he becomes a Super Saiyan 2. Another very similar moment is when we see that Cell realizes that he's totally outgunned by Super Saiyan 2 Gohan, even at his 100% in his perfect form, and so he decides to channel Frieza again. We see him getting this nefarious smile on his face and laughing, because he says, "But that still doesn't mean I lose just because I'm weaker," when he flies up into the air and proceeds to charge up a full power attack so that he could fire it at the Earth and really at Gohan, hoping to get rid of both of them in the process and destroy the planet before this is eventually deflected at him. And we saw Frieza pull a very similar maneuver when he was outmatched by Goku on Namek, in which he decided to charge up a technique and then throw the sphere directly at planet Namek, leading to it eventually, after 5+ minutes, being destroyed in the process. Furthermore, in another desperation measure, we see that Cell, after he had regenerated from Gohan's Kamehameha, proceeded to bulk up into this giant form so that he'd be able to turn all of his energy into raw power so that he could fight, but again, making a amateurish mistake, much like Goku chastised him for on Namek during the time in which he used the also discs that he might have learned from Krillin for all we know. And furthermore, in yet another last-ditch effort in desperation move, after Gohan hits him so hard that he spits out 18 and Cell reverts back into semi-perfect Cell, we find out that Cell tries to blow himself up to destroy the Earth, which proceeds to happen just with King Kai's plan instead. Rest in peace. So even though on the surface it doesn't seem like Cell and Frieza are all too similar in terms of their beings, the fact of the matter is when we look closer we start to see that in terms of not only their actions but also their personalities. Like for example, how Cell, much like Frieza, doesn't really seem to care about indiscriminately killing anyone who gets in the way of his goals. Like we see with Cell when he decides to blow up various different cities and absorb people in order to perfect himself and kind of pursue his ultimate goal. Much like how Frieza has no problem whatsoever killing anyone in his path or killing them simply in order to punish people who didn't listen to what he has to say, even going so far as to vaporize a child just because he wanted to show off exactly what he was capable of doing to anyone who did not listen to him. And really, the greatest similarities between Cell and Frieza truly seem to emerge when Cell becomes his perfect form. At this point, he assumes the role of the most powerful fighter at the time, and he begins to use this to his advantage to toy around with his enemies, something that Frieza did to constant effect on Namek, where he was far more powerful than everyone he fought, but in order to amuse himself in his own sadistic pleasure, he proceeded to continually toy around with them, including even Vegeta, who he lets mess around with him just so that he can get enjoyment out of it. He does the exact same thing with Goku, who he could have killed at any point before Goku became a Super Saiyan, and really even after that, as we could see right here. When he's powering up to full power, Goku says that he's going to let him reach his maximum, and this is what Frieza really wanted all along. Because if he didn't really want to try his true 100% power out against an enemy who also would be able to stand a chance against actually fighting against him, he would have just attacked the planet and gotten it all over with, rather than instead purposely allowing Goku to draw the fight out, and we see that Frieza confirms this with his laugh. This is no doubt something that Frieza wanted his entire life, because the fact that he was so powerful, no one really challenged him. Unless, of course, we count Beerus and Zeno and all the other gods of destruction and all the angels and things that, Toriyama didn't think of at the time. And the same thing happens with Cell. If he really wanted to, he could have just blown up the planet right here the second he became perfect, because he already basically won. He achieved his ultimate goal, his ultimate perfection. Instead, he toys around with Vegeta and even takes his attack just so that he could test out his own body, which also ties into the similarities in terms of the Saiyans and Cell, which I'll get into in a future video, especially with regard to these two characters we could see on screen right now of Vegeta and Cell. And the whole reason why Cell even decides to have the Cell games in the first place is because he wants to test himself at his full perfection, at his full power against the most powerful fighters at the time, even giving them more time in order to train, 10 days in fact, just so that they'll be able to pose a threat to him before he decides to basically begin his unrivaled, unchallenged rule of the universe, essentially becoming a far more destructive variation of Frieza and the androids simultaneously. With his whole fight against Goku, Cell could have beaten him at any time if he decided to go full power. However, instead, again, he wants to challenge himself and have fun against an enemy, just like Frieza did with Goku on Namek. And the parallel also goes even further, where Frieza is the one who ultimately causes Goku to become a Super Saiyan, which is his own undoing, in which he destroys Krillin, who at this point Goku knows will not be able to be wished back again with the Earth Dragon Balls, leading to Goku being so enraged and so full of anger, desperation, everything along those lines, that he becomes a Super Saiyan and eventually defeats Frieza. After once again Frieza uses yet another desperation move because his ego has been challenged and crushed at this point, in order to attack Goku, who responds in kind and destroys him until the retcon that Frieza is still alive. Whereas the exact same thing happens where Cell, upon finding out about Gohan's hidden power, decides to push him to the point to where he'll unlock it, and then kills Android 16, a non-human being who never gets wished back, which leads to Gohan going enraged after he hears the words of 16, and then in turn, also, just like with Goku becoming Super Saiyan on Namek, leads to Cell's eventual defeat and ultimate obliteration at the hands of this new Super Saiyan form. Now, in terms of abilities, I already talked a little bit about how Frieza and Cell both had the Death Ray beam that they had in Cell inherited from him. We know that Cell inherited a number of different abilities from his people that were a part of him. Another one, too, is that Cell has the ability to survive in space, which we see during the filler in the 10 days leading up to the Cell games, where he's destroying asteroids that are coming toward the Earth, and funny enough, basically saving the planet instead of destroying it before that happens. Makes me wonder if he actually went to heaven when he died in the manga continuity as a result of saving the planet, even though of course he was the one who wanted to destroy it anyway. Then of course later on there's also the possibility that Cell inherited Frieza's ability to survive regardless of what happens to his body, because the fact that Goku vaporizes Cell's head, his arms, his wings, his tail, all that stuff, and yet he survives long enough to in turn be able to regenerate in a far more effective way than we see from Piccolo. Something you could actually see me discuss with Quaman in a video in the top right corner about why Cell's regeneration is even better than Piccolo's. With all of this, of course, calling back to when Frieza was cut into pieces and still survived and was capable of floating around and everything after Goku had given him his energy, even though his organs were literally hanging right out of him. And then he survived in space after Namek's explosion, which he was basically already damaged and unconscious within when it happened for a very long period of time. And then furthermore, there's also the ability of creating the Cell Juniors. We know from a Toriyama interview from a little while ago that Frieza was asexually reproduced by King Cold. And then we see Cell here has the ability to asexually reproduce and create the Cell Juniors, who go on to fight against all the Z fighters and are already incredibly powerful the second they're born. So it's entirely possible that Cell also inherited this ability from Frieza through King Cold and Frieza himself, who no doubt would have that ability too. However, some people also suggest that he might have gotten it from King Piccolo, for instance, because we see him create children, although he does it in the form of eggs that he spits up from his mouth rather than a tail that we see spitting forth the Cell Juniors. So it could even be a combination of the two, or it could be something that the computer itself created along the way and maybe borrowed some aspects of the others. Plus, there's also the really disturbing theory that he might even use the reproductive organs of 17, 18 in order to create them, which I'm not going to go into in this video. And when it comes to the themes of these two different characters, I think another interesting thing to consider is also the fact that Frieza, after his defeat on Namek, came to the Earth as Mecha Frieza, a combination of robotic and artificial components with a biological body, which is the base. And interestingly enough, Cell himself is a bio-android, during which, in his own composure, was incorporated the cells from Frieza. So the main villain of the arc ends up essentially being a type of clone of Frieza, who himself is a bio-android. And another really interesting aspect of the story and the themes is the fact that both Frieza and Cell were inevitably killed by future Trunks, the very same future Trunks, in fact, for both of these different characters, wherein Trunks brought an end to the previous arc at the start of his own when he vaporized Frieza, and then eventually went on to kill King Cold, who also comprised some of Cell's cells, say that many times fast, as you could see in that video in the top right corner. Whereas with Cell, Trunks brought an end to this arc by killing him and stopping that infinite cycle in which Trunks was killed by Cell, who went back in time, creating another timeline, and so on, and brought peace to his future, at least until Dragon Ball Super. So there are definitely a lot of really interesting themes, similarities, biological abilities inherited, techniques, and that much more between these two characters and the overall effect that Frieza inevitably had on Cell. So what effect did Frieza have on Cell? Well, when you break it all down, I think that you could see that it was a good amount overall. Not only in terms of his biology, not only in terms of his abilities, whether they be technique or biological and natural in nature, but also in terms of his psychology, in terms of his temperament, and many of the actions he took along the way, which are in a sense echoing things that we saw from Frieza and other characters earlier in the story, which you could actually see me discuss more in depth in a video about time echoes in Dragon Ball Z in the top right corner. But overall, I think that this is definitely an interesting topic of discussion, and I'm going to be talking about the effect that other characters had on Cell along the way in the future. But what do you guys think? Let me know your own thoughts down below in the comments. Additionally, if you're new here, again, consider subscribing. That way you can stay up to date with all these future videos and that much more. Make sure to leave a like, share this video out so that more people can see it. Thank you all for watching this long and staying the entire time. You guys are awesome. And with that being said, make sure to stick around because there's a lot more to come in the future.
Yeah, and you better subscribe.